So previously we've talked about jet engines and the usefulness of jet engines. Today we're going to talk about solid engines. So basically rocket engines that use solid fuel. And there are some very big advantages and disadvantages to solid engines. There are a bunch of different types of propellants that are used in rocket fuels. The most common is a solid propellant, and that is where the fuel and the oxidizer are mixed together and they make a solid that is packed into a container. Liquid propellants are where you have a fuel and an oxidizer. You have those stored in different containers, and then they're mixed in a combustion chamber, and then that makes the rocket go. A hybrid is where you have a solid fuel and a liquid oxidizer, very similar to, just a mixture of the solid propellant and the liquid propellant, hence the name hybrid. And then a plasma or an ion thruster is radically different than both. A solid propellant rocket is composed of a number of different parts. We basically have some sort of a solid fuel. We have an igniter, which ignites the solid fuel. We have the place where the combustion happens. We have a nozzle, and we have exhaust. The fuel contains both the fuel and the oxidizer mixed together, and it is encased in a container with a hole down the middle. And that container, that hole can have different shapes, which we'll go into. And the hot gases are expelled out of the nozzle, and they produce thrust. The exhaust velocity of solid propellants are in the range of about 2,500 to 3,500 meters per second. There are a lot of uses for solid propellants. Model rockets, if you've ever shot a model rocket, you probably know that it used a solid propellant. You get the little canister and you can look up in there, and there's solid stuff packed in there. Smaller rockets, like the Pegasus rocket, uses a solid propellant. Boosters, which are used to help create more thrust during initial takeoff. They can be an integral part of the system, or they can be an add-on for heavier payloads. They can also be intercontinental ballistic missiles. So the benefits of a solid propellant, they're extremely simple, like I said. They've been used since the dawn of the space age, or since rockets have been used, which has been basically since like the 1200s. People were using very simple rockets. You can store them for long periods of time. You can create the rocket with the engine in it, right? All the fuel, all the oxidizer packed in there, and it can just sit there and be ready to go. It can be used immediately, right? So you store it for a long period of time. Then when you want to use it, you light it, it goes. So intercontinental ballistic missiles are a good example of this because they are stored for very long-term times. And when we want to use them, we want to use them very quickly. We don't want to fuel the rocket at the time of the launch if we're launching something like an intercontinental ballistic missile. There are a number of weaknesses of solid propellants also. They usually have a much lower specific impulse or exhaust velocity than the liquid propellants, which means that they're lower efficiency than liquid propellants. Once they are ignited, they burn until they're gone because you have the fuel and the oxidizer all mixed in together. And once you light that, it's going to burn until both the fuel and the oxidizers are completely gone, right? So you can't stop it. But what you could do is if it's used as a booster, you test the main engines first. So you turn on the main engines, which may use liquid propellants. Then you make sure all of that's working fine. If that's not working fine, you can cut those off and you can save your launch. Then once the main engines are working fine, then you ignite the boosters and then they take you up into orbit or do whatever they're supposed to do if they're used as a booster. If there is an issue with the launch, like you start firing the booster and something happens like right away, you could pop the top off of the boosters and then you'd have thrust going up and you'd have thrust going down. and that would balance. So then the rocket wouldn't move any place because you'd get thrust going up and thrust going down with balanced forces. That's not ideal because you have a large amount of like fire coming out the top and a large amount of fire going down, but that would balance it out so it wouldn't actually go anywhere. You could only do that if it was on the launch pad though, because once you get into the air, you wouldn't want to thrust up and down. So basically, you want to make sure that you're really ready to launch before you light these solid rockets. There is absolutely no throttle control. When you start them, you can't turn the engines down or you can't turn them up. So you basically have to program in the throttle control that you want using the grain pattern. They have a performance profile through the grain pattern. If you want to increase acceleration or decrease acceleration, you can shape the shape of the fuel, and that will allow it to thrust more or less as a function of time. It has a lot of polluting exhaust, so the fuel is not really great for the environment, but most rocket fuels aren't necessarily great for the environment. And then you have this thing called chuffing, basically where the solid propellants, you could get like little pockets that actually weren't burned. And so as it's finishing the burn, then you get these little pockets which basically could start burning again. And so you basically getting the engine sputtering at the end. So it stops and then it sputters a little bit and sputters and then sputters. And that might last for like a minute or something like that. And that's not really a big deal unless you're actually like launching constellation missions where you're like spitting one satellite out, waiting a second, spitting another satellite out, and that wouldn't be very good. If you look up the center of a rocket engine, a solid rocket engine, you could see the pattern of this. So the second one down shows a circle in the center, and that is something that we would think of as sort of common. That's basically like where the grain is burning in that center region, and then the fire is coming out. If you look at the one just underneath that, now the grain is in the center and the fire is happening on the outside and it's getting thrust. And then you could shape that so instead of having a circle, you could have like a star pattern. These grain patterns can control the thrust of the rocket as it's going up. So what is the grain made out of? It's made out of basically like a fuel and an oxidizer. So in a model rocket, you use this sorbitol sugar and you use saltpeter for the oxidizer, and you mix those together and then it burns. In early rockets, you use black powder. So you use something like charcoal and then you use saltpeter. And then the solid rocket boosters use ammonium and perchlorate as the oxidizer, and you mix those and then you create a grain pattern from that. So when you burn the grain, you can basically coat some surfaces that you don't want to burn with an inhibitor. A higher surface area of the grain means that you have more grain burned because it's more fuel is exposed, so more of it is burned. A lower surface area means less grain is burned, which means that you have less thrust. So the grain pattern actually tells us what the thrust profile will be of the rocket. And we're basically going to talk about that in the next lesson because it's a little complicated. But the general idea is that the shape of the grain pattern tells us what the thrust profile will be, whether the thrust is increasing with time or decreasing with time, or staying about the same as a function of time. So an example of why we would want to change the thrust is, let's say that we want to keep in a constant acceleration. Let's say that we're building a rocket, we're going to put people on board, and we want the acceleration to stay roughly at like 2 Gs, right? Well, as that rocket goes up, it loses mass because it's burning fuel. And if the thrust is constant, the acceleration will increase as a function of time because F equals ma. If force stays the same and mass decreases the acceleration has to increase to compensate. But what we could do is we could decrease the thrust to compensate for the decreased mass, which allows the acceleration to stay constant. So in summary, a solid propellant engines, they have several advantages and disadvantages. The advantages include that you can store them for long periods of time. They're very simple designs. They have immediate use. The disadvantages include that they're lower exhaust velocities than other fuels. You can't throttle the power or turn off or restart. But using a grain pattern, you can prescribe a throttling profile. Their main usages are with intercontinental ballistic missiles, small rockets, and boosters that you add on to rockets, and they provide more thrust during takeoff. And we'll talk about that in an upcoming lesson.